Today we've arrived at Proposition 29 in Book 4. At this stage, perhaps you've begun to wonder whether Spinoza is not maybe more interested in dismantling other people's ethical theories than in building an ethical theory of his own. We saw, first of all, that he denies free will. Secondly, he denies that there are objective moral facts. He's a moral anti-realist. He says, for example, that good and evil are nothing but the emotions of pleasure and pain, insofar as we are conscious of them. So these ideas depend on an individual, and there are no universal notions of good and evil. And we saw last day that the conatus is the only foundation of virtue. So Spinoza has declared himself to be a moral egoist. His ethics is firmly grounded in the principle of self-interest. So today he is going to take a different tack. In this sequence of propositions, we'll see him present his version of the golden rule, which he's going to derive from the principle of conatus and his rationalist metaphysics. So just to get an overview of where we're going, let's look at the three most important propositions in this sequence from 29 to 37. They are proposition 34, which states, insofar as men are assailed by emotions which are passions, they can be contrary to one another. Proposition 35, that insofar only as men live in obedience to reason, do they always necessarily agree in nature. And proposition 37, which states that the good which every man who follows after virtue desires for himself, he will also desire for other men, and so much the more in proportion as he has a greater knowledge of God. So the general theme here is one of how friendship is possible between men if they agree in nature. And he says that men whose ideas are adequate, whose emotions are active, who are governed by reason, they agree in nature. They can be friendly and benevolent towards each other. On the other hand, men whose ideas are inadequate, whose emotions are passive, they do not agree in nature and hence are not favorably disposed towards each other in general. So this is, I suppose, Spinoza's version of the twin commandments of love God and love thy neighbor. Jesus said, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. And that was the first commandment, and the second commandment is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In the theological political treatise, Spinoza affirms Jesus's view. He states that the whole law consists only in loving one's neighbor. He's presumably referring to the injunction to love one's neighbor that appears in Leviticus rather than the New Testament, but the in siding with Jesus, he is taking a stance against the rabbinical tradition in saying that the whole law consists only in loving one's neighbor. So, of these three propositions that I singled out, Proposition 34 hardly needs any, let me see if I can find it, 30, that's 35, 34. Insofar as men are assailed by emotions which are passions, they can be contrary to one another. If you've worked your way through Book 3, you'll see that this hardly needs any further elaboration than was given there. As far as Spinoza is concerned, to be assailed by emotions which are passions means that you don't understand what is causing you to act in one way or another. So under those circumstances, it is only to be expected that people will not necessarily be favorably disposed to each other and generally seek um, to use other people rather than to behave benevolently towards them. We've seen so much in that sense working through Book 3. So the propositions leading up to this, I don't think we need to spend very much time on. Propositions 29 to 31, I've grouped under the heading, we can only be affected by things whose nature has something in common with our own. And he unfolds this in three propositions summarized in a corollary following Proposition 31. Hence it follows that in proportion as a thing is in harmony with our nature, so is it more useful or better for us, and vice versa. In proportion as a thing is more useful for us, so is it more in harmony with our nature. Now he goes on to show that men who are driven by passion do not share a common nature. Proposition 32 says that insofar as men are prey to passion, they cannot, in that respect, be said to be naturally in harmony. Proposition 33, men can differ in nature insofar as they are assailed by these emotions, those emotions which are passions or passive states, and to this extent, one and the same man is variable and inconstant. And Proposition 34, insofar as men are assailed by emotions which are passions, they can be contrary to one another. As I said, I don't think this merits spending any more time on it, particularly if you've taken the trouble to work through Book 3. On the other hand, Proposition 35, which affirms the converse, to the extent that men's emotions are active, they do share a common nature. This is, I think, very interesting and worth spending some time on and delving into the argument that he presents in support of the proposition. If you look at this phrase here, he's referring to human nature insofar as it is defined by reason. Now he's asking us to do a thought experiment here to to try to understand what the nature or essence of a human mind would be if it was characterized by the property that it is defined by reason, contrary, of course, to the normal run of human minds. So this is a thought experiment like the whole of Book Three, in fact, is a thought experiment where Spinoza asks us to imagine the mind of a person who has no power of reason and who is entirely driven by passion. And he will do something similar towards the end of Book Four, where there's a series of propositions about what he calls the free man. The free man doesn't actually exist, but it's a sort of limiting case and presented as a limiting case of what human rationality might actually attain to. So I'll use this term free man to refer to this ideal type of human nature that Spinoza is asking us to think about in this proposition. And the key reference here is to proposition 41 in book 2, which states that knowledge of the second and third kinds is necessarily true. So he's asking us to imagine a mind governed by reason whose knowledge, therefore, is necessarily true. Now, if you haven't read book 2, it's unfortunately necessary to delve into it in order to get to the bottom of what he is talking about here. His conception of a true idea, I think the best place to point to would be the opening lines of the proof of proposition 48 in book 2. That proposition states that he who has a true idea simultaneously knows that he has a true idea and cannot doubt of the truth of the thing perceived. So, like the other 17th century rationalists, Spinoza believes that we can have direct access to reality through what he calls clear and distinct ideas. That term, clear and distinct, is borrowed from Descartes. In Spinoza's usage, it's synonymous with adequate or true, as referred to ideas. So the the first line in the proof of that proposition is that a true idea in us is an idea which is adequate in God, insofar as he is displayed through the nature of the human mind. And much of book 2 is really devoted to an explanation of what this statement means. So I'll briefly recapitulate it because I think it's really important to understand Spinoza's argument in the proof of this proposition, proposition 35 that we're concerned with. So when Spinoza talks about ideas, he's using that word in two senses. Ideas in the mind of God and ideas in the mind of man. For ideas in the mind of God, that the key proposition is proposition 7 in book 2, which states that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. So this is usually known as the parallelism of the attributes of thought and extension. There is one substance, God or nature, two of whose attributes are known to us, thought and extension. The modes or individual things under the attribute of thought are bodies, and the modes under the attribute of extension are ideas. And Spinoza is saying there is a one-to-one correspondence between ideas and things. So the way I understand this is just that Spinoza is saying that the principle of sufficient reason, which guarantees that there is a sufficient or adequate explanation for any given thing, sets up a correspondence between the attributes of thought and the attributes of extension. That for everything or every body under the attribute of extension, there is an adequate explanation of that thing, and this is an idea in the mind of God. Now, for the second usage of the word idea, this is idea in the mind of man. The human mind for Spinoza is an idea in the mind of God, but the individual ideas that make it up are truncated versions of God's ideas, okay? Because a human mind can only know about the things external to itself through the impact that those things have on the human body. So this is why Spinoza says that the ideas in the human mind are characteristically confused or fragmented or disordered. So this is the default state of affairs in the human mind, as long as its ideas are not arranged according to the intellectual order. So when Spinoza says that a true idea in us is an idea which is adequate in God insofar as he is displayed through the nature of the human mind, what he means is that a true idea is one of God's ideas that has survived this operation of truncation that's entailed in when it is instantiated in a human mind. But Spinoza says that the person who is governed by reason, the free man that we are speculating about, his knowledge is of the second and third kind, and both of these kinds of knowledge are necessarily true. Okay, so the free man, his ideas are God's ideas. So what would it mean if you confronted two of these free men with evidence of some situation or other? If they were presented with the same evidence, they would understand the situation in the same way, or at least they would strive to understand it in that way. So how would they act in that situation? They would necessarily act in the same way. They would each of them make a necessarily true prediction about the outcome of the situation and align themselves in accordance with that prediction. So the two of them would act in the same way, and well, if they can't be distinguished one from the other by their actions, they would share a common nature. This is the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So this seems to be what Spinoza means when he says that coming back to the statement of Proposition 35, men, insofar as they live in obedience to reason, necessarily only do such things as are necessarily good for human nature. They have a common nature and act in the furtherance of the preservation of that common human nature. And given that they act in this way, they only do such things as are good for each individual man. Okay, in other words, such things are as are in harmony with each man's nature. Okay, so it's an extremely radical, unusual argument that purports to derive the golden rule from um, Spinoza's rational metaphysics, rationalist metaphysics. He doesn't actually say that they are one and the same. He says these two free men that we've been speculating about, merely that they share a common nature. So there is, I guess, some scope for asking what exactly he means by this sort of statement, but it's worth flagging here that later on we'll see um, in part 4 in the sequence of propositions dealing with the free man that he doesn't shy away from drawing equally extravagant conclusions about the nature of this free man. He will say things such as, if a man was born free, he would have no conception of good and evil. Okay, because uh, to say that he is free, that he is governed solely by the dictates of reason, means that he doesn't have inadequate ideas, and that means that he doesn't have painful emotions. So there's the need to distinguish pleasure from pain never arises. He will say that the free man thinks of death least of all things. Um, I'll just mention, by the way, in case you're wondering about uh, the the motto or on the banner on the YouTube page. It's the Latin statement of this assertion here that the free man thinks of death least of all things. Why would that be the case? Well, the free man thinks God's thoughts and is entirely in collaboration with the inevitable. If he's about to die, he has no problem with his imminent death. He will also say that the free man can't lie. And the reason for that appears to be that the free man is governed by reason, and a lie would be a betrayal of reason. Um, the in this connection, I would say that if you're not sort of shocked by the degree of Spinoza's commitment to reason on your first encounter with Spinoza, then you probably haven't understood the extent of it. But it really is radically different from the run of the mill in philosophy. So much for the proof. I'm not claiming that he has actually made the proof, but I do think his argument is extremely interesting. So a corollary then to this proposition is that there is no individual thing in nature which is more useful to man than a man who lives in obedience to reason. And in the second corollary, as every man seeks most that which is useful to him, so men are most useful to each other. And he expands a bit on this in the Scholium. What we have just shown is attested by experience so conspicuously that it is in the mouth of nearly everyone. Man is to man a god. Yet it rarely happens that men live in obedience to reason, for things are so ordered among them that they are generally envious and troublesome to one another, as we have seen at great length in Book 3. Nevertheless, they are scarcely able to lead a solitary life, so that the definition of man as a social animal has met with general assent. In fact, men do derive from social life much more convenience than injury. And when all is said, they will find that men can provide for their wants much more easily by mutual help, and that only by uniting their forces can they escape from the dangers that on every side beset them. Moving on then, the Spinoza will say that the highest good, which you might remember from the last proposition that we covered last day, the highest good is the knowledge of God. The highest good is common to all. The highest good, the statement of proposition 36, is that the highest good of those who follow virtue is common to all, and therefore all can equally rejoice therein. So the proof, let me read it, to act virtuously is to act in obedience to reason. Whatsoever we endeavor to do in obedience to reason is to understand. And he said last day that the only thing we know to be certainly good is that which conduces to understanding. The highest good for those who follow after virtue is to know God, because that is the highest form of understanding. So this is a good which is common to all, can be possessed by all men equally, insofar as they are of the same nature. And in the Scholium, he bolsters that by an appeal to another proposition in Book 2, which says that the human mind, every human mind, has an adequate knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God, which is to say that it has this knowledge of God in common with all other human minds. So proposition 37, the last one we cover today. The good which every man who follows after virtue desires for himself, he will also desire for other men, and so much the more in proportion as he has a greater knowledge of God. And in the proof, he states that, that because men who live in obedience to reason are most useful to their fellow men, we shall, in obedience to reason, necessarily endeavor to bring about that men should live in obedience to reason. In other words, we shall seek to promote this ideal human nature, the nature of the free man, which he talked about in Proposition 35, and we will seek to do this not for instrumental reasons. What he's saying here is that we shall seek to promote rationality as an end in itself. And then he, adds in then some statements about God. The essence of the mind consists in knowledge, which involves the knowledge of God. This is the proposition from Book 2 that I just cited. And as the mind's essence involves a greater knowledge of God, so also will be greater the desire of the follower of virtue that other men should possess that which he seeks as good for himself. Now, the second proof is interesting, okay, because here, okay, what is shown is that the man who is governed by reason actually seeks to induce others to be governed by reason as well. And in general, this pattern of behavior is one that Spinoza defined as the passion of ambition in Book 3. Okay, this is the reference to Book 3. The good which a man desires for himself and loves, he will love more constantly if he sees that others love it also. So ambition, he traces to one of the consequences of our general tendency to imitate the emotion of others. And in the default situation, this tendency to get others to like the things that we like is simply a passion, okay? And it's one that causes people to be troublesome to each other. So he refers to this in the Scholium. He who, guided by emotion only, endeavors to cause others to love what he loves himself, and to make the rest of the world live according to his own fancy, acts solely by impulse and is therefore hateful, especially to those who take delight in something different and accordingly study and by similar impulse endeavor to make men live in accordance with what pleases themselves. Again, let me continue. As the highest good sought by men under the guidance of emotion is often such that it can be possessed by a single individual, it follows that those who love it are not consistent in their intentions, but while they delight to sing its praises, fear to be believed. Okay, so this is the normal course of the passion of ambition. And he's contrasting this with the situation that he has described in the proof of Proposition 37, where he says, we shall, in obedience to reason, necessarily endeavor to bring about that men should live, that other men should live in the same way, in obedience to reason. So in one case, he's talking about an active emotion of ambition, and in the other, a passive emotion. We'll see that he gives a different name to it. He calls it honor. But it's really useful at this point to bear in mind, okay, that he's taken a particular passion and exhibited it he's taken a particular emotion and exhibited it in two ways, once as a passion and once as an active emotion. And that pattern is something that he's going to repeat again and again, roughly from about Proposition 40 to about Proposition 60. He will take an emotion which he described as a passion in Book 3 and show how its character changes if the mind's idea, the cognitive aspect of this emotion is activated. There's one other thing I intended to mention there. Yeah, this business of imitating emotions, okay, which is universal, even if we're not cognizant of it, which leads to our experience of things like emotions and, excuse me, things like pity and benevolence and what else? Imitating the desire of others, desiring things just because we see others desire them, which Spinoza puts at the root of this passion of ambition he's been talking about here. All of this is just part of our sociobiology. It's neither positive or negative, but it can be either passive or active, depending on whether or not the mind is actively engaged in understanding what is behind the the emotion, and this understanding changes the character of the emotion. So this is how Spinoza can maintain that every emotion can, which manifests initially as a passion, has the potential to be transformed into an active emotion. So we'll see many examples of this as we go on. So returning then to this scholium to proposition 37, he takes this opportunity to introduce a few more definitions, and he will use these later on in Book 5, for example. So he defines religion as whatsoever we desire and do, whereof we are the cause, insofar as we possess the idea of God or know God, I set down to religion. And the desire of well-doing, which is engendered by a life according to reason, I call piety. Further, the desire whereby a man living according to reason is bound to associate others with himself in friendship, I call honor. And by honorable, I mean that which is praised by men living according to reason. And by base, I mean that which is repugnant to the gaining of friendship. He says, I have also shown in addition what are the foundations of a state. Okay, why it is necessary for us to organize ourselves into civil society, given that the default situation of the human is to be driven by passion rather than by reason. And he will go on to develop this at some length in a second scholium to this proposition 37, which we will cover next day. I'll just finish up for today by pointing out to a rather notorious statement that he makes here concerning animal rights. He says that the law against the slaughtering of animals is founded rather on vain superstition and womanish pity than on sound reason. So in a single sentence, he's managed to offend modern sensibilities on not just on one score, but on two scores. But it's worth, I think, understanding where he is coming from. For Spinoza, he says that we have the same rights in respect to them, in respect to animals, as they have in respect to us. Nay, as everyone's right is defined by his virtue or power, men have far greater rights over beasts than beasts over men. So the general picture here for Spinoza is that man and animals and plants and every individual thing is a mode of substance, God or nature. And all of these modes of substance play by the same rules on the same level playing field, all of them seeking to preserve their being, whether by competing with each other or by collaborating with each other, all engaged in the same enterprise. And it's just a fact of nature that animals eat other animals and human beings eat animals. Okay? But so for Spinoza, nature is indeed red in tooth and claw, and that's just the way things are. This reference to womanish pity, which other translators would call unmanly pity, uh, is just a squeamishness which Spinoza would say ultimately has its root in our anthropocentric fantasy that things really are or ought to be designed to please us. And this, persists. It's pretty much animates, um, let's say, Schopenhauer's views on how nature works in general. And Spinoza just faces the issue and without any further agonizing. So, as I say, I think it's worth understanding Spinoza's position. Obviously, we have to take account of the fact that he was writing at a particular time when it would have been impossible to conceive a situation such as the one we find ourselves in, the Anthropocene, where we are on the verge of trashing the entire planet through our inability to recognize our absolute dependency on the environment for our self-preservation. Okay, so we leave it there for today. Next day, we will do the second scholium to this proposition, where Spinoza briefly describes his understanding of the role of the state and the role of the citizen in a state.